what's on the inside? What's on your inside? As we showed the kids, we are all the same on the inside. We are bones and ligaments and muscles, hearts and veins. But what's different comes from in here and up here. Many of us have heard a story about seeing someone and judging them based on their looks. Judging a book by its cover. How many of us are guilty of doing the same? My son Bob just returned home from 3 months in Europe. He was backpacking all over, living out of his backpack. And he told me a story about one day in Berlin as he sat on a park bench just enjoying the day. And he said this gentleman came up to him and sat down, and they struck up a conversation, because my son can talk to anybody anywhere. And this man went on, and he was, saying, what are you doing? Have you got a place to stay? And he was genuinely worried, thinking that my son was homeless. And when I picked him up from the airport, trust me, he looked homeless. But that man took the time to get to know Bob. But first appearances said that he was a homeless young man. Last week, we were introduced to Saul, the newly elected king of the people of Israel. He was exactly what they had chosen, exactly what they wanted, and they were confident in Saul, because Saul on the outside was gorgeous. We read that he was as handsome a young man as could be found anywhere in Israel. He was probably well-dressed, well-groomed. He walked proudly, maybe a little swagger, talked a big talk, and looked down on the people of Israel. Unfortunately for the people of Israel, Saul didn't align his life with God or rule the nation according to what God wanted. On the inside, he was, as we read in the story on page 106, he was cruel, vindictive, and greedy. He was a coward, and he backpedaled when he was caught in a lie or something that he shouldn't have said. He was outwardly what they thought a king should be. But on the inside, he didn't have the backbone, the integrity, the faith, the vision that God would want. The people of Israel wanted a king, and God gave them a king, an outward manifestation of what they wanted, to show them God's way, to bring them back to God's story. But Saul on the inside was definitely not what God would ultimately choose. He was letting them have their way. And I'm going to invite you to consider whether we still choose, elect people like that. Whether we still go for bravado and boisterous. Whether we still choose show and sham. Whether we choose people who speak with authority, even not knowing what they're talking about. People who speak and show their contempt for others. Whether we still choose the outward facade of a person rather than looking at what they represent on the inside. Whether we still fall for claims that they will make everything great again without exploring how they're going to do it. We need to recognize what that means for us, because it's a global phenomenon. Just how deep do we look? Not just as at our political leaders, but at the people that surround us, or even at ourselves. Do we see as God sees? Do we see God in the people around us? Here in the next chapter of the story, we see God choosing the political leader. God choosing who God would have lead his people. And we hear how this happened on page 145. Then they arrived. Samuel saw Eliab and thought, surely the Lord's anointed stands here before the Lord. Coming to the people and going to one family, knowing that there were all of these sons, and he started with the oldest. But the Lord said to Samuel, do not consider his appearance or his height, for I have rejected him. The Lord does not look at the things people look at. People look at the outward appearance, but the Lord looks at the heart. Then Jesse called Abinadab and had him pass in front of Samuel, but Samuel said, the Lord has not chosen this one either. Then Jesse had Shammah pass by, but Samuel said, nor has the Lord chosen this one. Jesse had 7 of his sons pass before Samuel, but Samuel said to him, the Lord has not chosen these. So he asked Jesse, are these all the sons you have? There is still the youngest, Jesse answered, but he is tending the sheep. Samuel said, send for him, and we will not sit down until he arrives. So he sent for him and brought him in. He was glowing with health and had a fine appearance. The Lord said, rise and anoint him. This is the one. So Samuel took the horn of oil and anointed him in the presence of his brother. And that from that day on, the Spirit of the Lord came powerfully upon David. God didn't choose the oldest, he chose the youngest, the least, the unlikely, not the way society would choose. God chose the shepherd, the one that would have been ritually unclean and looked down on. God chose the unlikely again to show his power, to show his might. God chose David, and to show his choice, he anointed him with the holy oil to mark him as his choice. David was anointed, but he had a long way to go before inauguration. He had a lot to learn. In fact, we hear from the time he was anointed till the time he was inaugurated was 14 years. He must have had a lot to learn. But he wasn't idle during this time. He was doing the work of the Lord. But more than that, he was writing poems, psalms. Most of our psalms are written by David. He was writing prayers. He was living his faith. But he must have wondered, after putting his faith in God and God showing that he had faith in David, why wasn't he actually making him the king right away? He'd chosen him after all. And Saul was getting into all kinds of trouble. But God knew he wasn't ready yet. He still had a lot to learn. He still needed to see what was going on in the world. He still needed to show what was on the inside, his courage. One of the stories we hear is how David was asked about what he did. And he told them the story about overcoming ferocious foes, lions and tigers and bears, oh my. Okay, not the tigers part, just the lions and the bears. We read in 1 Samuel 17, David said to them, your servant has been keeping his father's sheep. When a lion or bear came and carried off a sheep from the flock, I went after it, struck it, and rescued the sheep from its mouth. When it turned on me, I seized it by its hair, struck and killed it. That's what a leader does. He cares, or she cares, for the people or the charges, the sheep of his flock. That's what a true leader does, showing compassion. And then he went on to face an even more ferocious foe. in the passage that Bob read today, we hear about David going up against Goliath, and we are very familiar with this story. God orchestrated this showdown. God needed David to defeat Goliath to show God's might, God's power, God's strength. And then we read that Saul dressed David in his own tunic. He put his armor on him. He put his helmet on him. He gave him his sword and his javelin. And poor David could hardly walk around in all this stuff. And he said, I can't do this. And he took it all off again, and armed with a sling and 5 small, smooth stones that he picked up out of the river, he went to face Goliath. Because if he had gone in with all the armor, would we believe that it was God that was working? But with 5 small stones and faith in God, that's how Goliath was defeated. David placed his faith in God and called on God to do the work, not taking any glory at all. In fact, we read, he said, you come against me with sword and spear and javelin, but I come against you in the name of the Lord Almighty, the God of the armies of Israel, whom you have defied. This day the Lord will deliver you into my hands. David, a true leader, showed what it took to be a political leader in God's army by putting his faith in God and by being willing to learn. A true leader is always willing to learn, not saying that they know everything right off the bat. And a true leader is caring and compassionate, and he wrote many psalms. And later on, we're going to hear one of his psalms of comfort. A leader, according to God, is one who has what it takes on the inside. Not all flash and show, not all boisterous and rhetoric. What is it that God saw in David? We read that he had a humble heart, a faithful spirit, and he was an obedient servant. God testified concerning him, I have found David, son of Jesse, a man after my own heart. He will do everything I want him to do. That's the kind of leader that God needed. That's the kind of person that God wants to build his nation on. What is it that God sees in your heart? Is it a humble spirit? It is a faithful spirit? Are you an obedient servant? I want to tell you a story. A disreputable man wandered into a church one day. He was unkempt, he was dirty, he was scruffy, he had a beard, and he walked around the church for about 30 minutes while it was filling with people for the service, and only 3 out of approximately 2,000 people even said hello to him. He asked for change to buy food. No one would give him anything. He went into the sanctuary to sit down at the front of the church. Wasn't Presbyterian at all, obviously. And was asked by the ushers whether he would prefer really to sit at the back. He greeted people and was greeted back with stares and dirty looks, with people looking down their noses and judging him. He sat at the back and he listened to the church announcements and such. And when they were all done, the elders of the church went up and they were excited to introduce the new pastor that was coming to the church for the very first time. We'd like to introduce you to Pastor Jeremiah Stepek. And the congregation looked around with joy and anticipation, and there was clapping, right up until the man at the back started to walk up the middle aisle. And the clapping stopped. and the silence settled and all eyes were on him, he walked up to the altar and took the microphone from the elders. And then he recited, "Then the king will say to those on his right, 'Come, you who are blessed by my Father, take your inheritance, the kingdom prepared for you since the creation of the world. For I was hungry, and you gave me something to eat. I was thirsty, and you gave me something to drink. I was a stranger, and you invited me in. I needed clothes, and you clothed me. I was sick, and you looked after me. I was in prison, and you came to visit me.' Then the righteous will answer him, 'Lord, when did we see you hungry and feed you, or thirsty and give you something to drink? When did we see you a stranger and invite you in, or needing clothes and clothe you? When did we see you sick or in prison and go to visit you?' And the king will say, 'Truly, I tell you, what you did for the least of these, you did for me.'" After Jeremiah recited this, he looked out at the congregation and told them what he had experienced that morning. Many began to cry, and there were a lot of heads that were bowed in shame. He then said, "Today I see a gathering of people, not a church of Jesus Christ. The world has enough people, but not enough disciples. When will you decide to become disciples?" Then he dismissed them and sent them home. This is a true story. Does your outside show what's on your inside? Do your actions reflect your faith? Are you the kind of person that God wants to help build his nation? In our lower stories, we often look at people and think they are undeserving. We look at ourselves and think we're undeserving, like we are the lowliest, like we're only good enough to tend sheep. We're not king material. We're not leader material. We think God can't possibly use me to create his wonderful nation. I didn't speak well. You may think, I didn't go to seminary. I'm unemployed. I'm retired. I'm just a kid. I don't know my Bible backward and forward. I've only recently come to faith. But David's story, a shepherd boy's unlikely rise to power, reminds us that in God's upper story, God often uses the underdog, the unlikely, to advance his plan. It's not what's on the outside. It's not the veneer that we put on, the sheen of bravado, the big talk. It's not that counts. It's what's on the inside. It's how we act, how we live out our faith. If we have humble hearts and faithful spirits, if we are obedient servants, God knows what's on the inside. He knows what's in here and up here. Following in the footsteps of Jesus Christ should be more than just talk. It should be more than just the sheen on the outside. God is not impressed with rank or title or status. God is impressed with what's on the inside. He doesn't look at gender or race or age or disability or religion. God looks at what's in our hearts and our willingness to be and to do what he needs us to be and to do. And he knows that if we have a willingness to go all in,